When I decided to take a break from city life and head out for an RV camping trip in the remote woods of northern Idaho, I was looking forward to nothing more than some peace and quiet. My name's Alden Gable, and after 10 years of working as an emergency room nurse at St. Alphonsus in Boise, I needed a change of pace. The chaos, the constant influx of patients, the life or death decisions, it had all taken its toll. The final straw came after a particularly grueling 12-hour shift where we lost 3 patients in rapid succession: a car crash victim, an elderly man with a massive heart attack, and a young girl with severe anaphylaxis. I could still hear their families' wails echoing in my dreams. That night I went home, pulled up my vacation days on my laptop, and requested a month off. My supervisor, understanding the burnout in my eyes, approved it without question. I wasn't running away, mind you, just taking some time to clear my head. I'd always been the guy who enjoyed solitude, who found peace in the absence of noise. Growing up in rural Montana had instilled in me a deep appreciation for wilderness, something I'd lost touch with during my years in the medical field. So when I hitched my 2018 Winnebago Mini to my truck and drove off into the wilderness, I was ready to immerse myself in nature, to let the sound of rustling leaves replace the shrill alarms of the hospital. After consulting several hiking forums and outdoors websites, I found a spot deep within the Clearwater National Forest where the trees grew so thick that they blotted out the sky, a place where ancient cedars and towering pines created a natural cathedral of silence. The nearest town, a small settlement called Pierce with barely 500 residents, was 28 miles away, and the only signs of human presence were the remnants of an old logging road that led me to this secluded spot. The road itself was barely maintained, with potholes and overgrown vegetation making the journey feel like an adventure in itself. My RV bounced and swayed over the rough terrain, but I pressed on, knowing that the isolation would be worth it. It was perfect. No cell service, no people, just the kind of digital detox I desperately needed. The first day was exactly what I'd hoped for. I set up camp in a small clearing, taking care to level the RV on the uneven ground. I spent the afternoon setting up my outdoor space, unfolding my favorite camp chair, arranging my cooking equipment, and gathering firewood from the surrounding area. As evening approached, I made myself a hearty dinner of canned beans and venison sausage I'd picked up from a local butcher in Pierce. I sat by the campfire, watching the flames dance as night fell, feeling the tension in my shoulders slowly begin to unwind. The darkness here was absolute, the kind that makes you feel like the last person on earth. The stars above shone with an intensity I'd forgotten existed, freed from the light pollution of the city. I went to bed with a clear mind for the first time in months, eager to explore the surrounding trails the next day. The second day, however, things took an unexpected turn that would forever change my perspective on the natural world. I woke up early, just as the first rays of sunlight were filtering through the trees. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the sweet scent of pine needles and damp earth. I brewed some coffee in my percolator, its familiar burbling providing a comforting soundtrack to the morning's silence. Over breakfast, I studied my topographical map, planning a route that would take me deeper into the forest, to a place marked only as Old Clearwater, an area supposedly abandoned after the logging industry moved on decades ago. The name had caught my eye during my research, and something about it called to me. As I ventured further from the campsite, the forest began to change in subtle but unsettling ways. The trees grew taller, their trunks thicker, and the underbrush became more tangled, almost as if the forest was swallowing itself. The familiar sounds of birds and insects I'd grown accustomed to faded away, replaced by an eerie silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The air grew noticeably cooler, and a thin mist began to curl around the bases of the trees. Still, I pressed on, convinced it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I was a medical professional. I dealt in facts and evidence, not superstition. After about an hour of hiking, marking my trail with bright orange surveyor's tape, I stumbled upon what appeared to be the remnants of an old logging camp. The sight stopped me in my tracks. Rusted equipment lay scattered across the clearing like the bones of ancient mechanical beasts. Broken down cabins with collapsed roofs, several ancient Mack trucks from the 1950s with their tires long since rotted away, and various pieces of logging equipment I couldn't identify. Nature had begun to reclaim the site. Moss covered everything, and small saplings grew through the rusted-out beds of the trucks. The place had a strange atmosphere, like it had been frozen in time, untouched by the world for decades. As I walked among the ruins, my boots crunching on dead leaves and broken glass from shattered windows, I noticed something odd that my medical training couldn't explain away. There were no signs of wildlife, no birds, no small animals, nothing. In any normal forest setting, an abandoned area like this would be teeming with life. Squirrels would be darting through the ruins, birds would be nesting in the broken equipment, and insects would be everywhere. But here, there was nothing. It was as if this place had been abandoned by more than just people. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I felt an inexplicable sense of being watched, a sensation I'd experienced before in the hospital when patients were about to crash, that sixth sense that something was deeply wrong. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to my mind getting the better of me. After all, I was a man of science, grounded in reality, not one to believe in the supernatural. My job had taught me to trust observable facts, not feelings or intuition. But something about this place made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't rationalize. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on my eardrums like I was deep underwater. I decided it was best to head back to the campsite, marking my return path with fresh surveyor's tape, even though I could still see my original markers. On my way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. It wasn't just paranoia. I could feel something in the air, a presence that seemed to be stalking me from a distance. My medical training kicked in as I noticed my own physiological responses: elevated heart rate, increased perspiration, dilated pupils. Fight or flight response, I told myself clinically, trying to maintain some professional detachment from my growing fear. I quickened my pace, clutching the small hunting knife I'd brought along, more for peace of mind than anything else, though I knew it would be useless against any serious threat. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the ground that seemed to reach for me like grasping fingers. I hurriedly gathered some wood for a fire, wanting to chase away the encroaching darkness. My hands shook slightly as I arranged the kindling, a detail that didn't escape my clinical self-assessment. As the flames grew, I felt a bit more at ease, but that lingering unease never fully left me. I decided to stay close to the RV that night, keeping my back to the solid metal wall of the vehicle rather than sitting exposed by the fire. The fire crackled, and I forced myself to relax, trying to enjoy the solitude that I had come here for. I heated up some soup on my camp stove, though I barely tasted it as I ate. But as the night wore on, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. The sounds of the forest had gone silent again, and I could feel the oppressive weight of the surrounding darkness pressing in on me. Then I heard it. A noise, faint at first, like the crunching of leaves underfoot. I froze, straining my ears to listen, my spoon halfway to my mouth. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I was familiar with. And in my years growing up in Montana, I'd encountered plenty of wildlife. This was different, slow, deliberate, and heavy, like something large moving through the underbrush with purpose. I grabbed my flashlight, a powerful LED model I'd bought specifically for this trip, and scanned the perimeter of the campsite. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. But the sound persisted, circling the campsite methodically, as if whatever was making it was studying me, learning my movements. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Whatever it was out there, watching me with an intelligence that felt predatory yet calculating. Suddenly the noise stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crackling of my fire and the thunder of my own heartbeat in my ears. For a moment I thought maybe it had left, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I saw it, a massive shape, just beyond the reach of the firelight, moving slowly between the trees with an almost human-like deliberation. It was tall, easily over 8 feet, and covered in dark matted fur that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Its body was hunched, with long arms that nearly touched the ground as it moved, ending in what appeared to be massive clawed hands. It reminded me of a grizzly bear, but everything about its proportions was wrong. Its movements were too fluid, too calculated, displaying a kind of intelligence that sent ice through my veins. I felt a surge of panic, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My medical mind cataloged my symptoms even as I backed toward the RV. Tachycardia, hyperventilation, peripheral vasoconstriction, classic severe fear response. The creature stopped, its head tilting slightly as if it was sizing me up. I could feel its gaze locked on me, even though I couldn't see its face in the darkness. My mind raced as I fumbled with the door handle, finally wrenching it open and stumbling inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The RV suddenly felt like a flimsy barrier between me and the thing outside. I grabbed the shotgun I'd brought along, a Remington 870 that I'd purchased years ago but rarely used, loading it with shaking hands. I wasn't a hunter, but I'd taken it with me just in case, more out of respect for the wilderness than any expectation of danger. Now I was glad I had it, though I doubted its effectiveness against whatever was out there. The silence outside was unnerving, broken only by the occasional pop from the dying fire. I crept to the window, peeking out through a small crack in the blinds. The creature was gone, but the darkness beyond my camp seemed alive with malevolent purpose. I stayed up all night, shotgun in hand, every creak and groan of the RV making me jump. My medical training helped me stay focused, treating the situation like a long emergency room shift. But this was different from anything I'd encountered in my professional life. This wasn't a trauma I could treat or a condition I could diagnose. This was something else entirely. I knew I couldn't stay here. My survival instincts, both professional and primitive, were screaming at me to leave. As soon as dawn broke, casting weak gray light through the trees, I packed up my things, ready to leave this cursed place behind. But as I stepped outside, my heart nearly stopped. There, in the soft earth around the campsite, were the tracks, huge clawed footprints that circled the RV repeatedly, showing how the creature had paced around my shelter all night. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, certainly not bear-like despite their size. The prints were almost hand-like, with opposing thumbs, suggesting a terrifying level of dexterity. My blood ran cold as I realized that whatever that thing was, it had been watching me all night, waiting, perhaps thinking, certainly planning. I didn't waste any more time. I threw everything into the RV haphazardly, not bothering to secure it properly, and started the engine. My hands shook as I drove away from the campsite, leaving those tracks behind, my tires throwing up dirt and gravel as I sped down the logging road faster than was safe. I didn't stop until I reached Pierce, my mind racing with what I had just experienced. The town looked different now, its sleepy appearance feeling like a facade hiding darker truths. I went straight to the local sheriff's office, needing to tell someone, anyone, what had happened. A grizzled man named Clyde Winters, who'd been sheriff for over 2 decades according to the plaque on his desk, listened to my story with a skeptical eye but didn't dismiss me outright. When I finished, he let out a long sigh that spoke volumes. "You're not the first to report something like this," he said, leaning back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "We've had a few folks come through here with similar stories, usually out-of-towners, just like you. Most of them chalk it up to wild animals, but what you're describing, it's different." I showed him the photos I'd taken of the tracks with my phone, and his expression hardened. "Those are unlike any bear tracks I've ever seen," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Could be some kind of mutation, maybe, or something we don't understand. Either way, it's dangerous." Clyde called in a couple of his deputies, younger men, who looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern, and they headed out to the campsite to investigate. I waited in town, nursing a cup of coffee at the local diner, my medical mind trying to rationalize what I'd seen while my instincts told me there was no rational explanation. Hours passed before the deputies returned, their expressions grim. They confirmed the tracks but found nothing else. No sign of the creature, no evidence beyond the footprints, which they photographed extensively. One deputy, a former wildlife biologist, admitted he'd never seen anything like them. I left Idaho the next day, still shaken by the experience, but determined to put it behind me. Clyde and his deputies took my story seriously, at least, and promised to keep an eye on the area, though I could tell from their expressions they hoped never to encounter whatever had made those tracks. As I drove back to Boise, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror every few minutes, half expecting to see that hulking shape following me. But it didn't, and for that I was grateful. The drive home was long, giving me too much time to think about what I'd encountered. By the time I reached my apartment, I was exhausted, physically and mentally. I parked the RV, grabbed my bags, and headed inside. The familiar sounds of the city, traffic, sirens, people, a welcome relief from the eerie silence of the forest. It was only when I was unpacking my things that I found it. A clump of matted fur caught in the latch of the RV door, dark and coarse, like nothing I'd ever seen before. I stared at it for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest, my medical training urging me to analyze it, to understand it. But fear won out over curiosity. I didn't know what that creature was, and I didn't want to find out. I threw the fur into the trash and locked my door, checking the locks twice before finally allowing myself to relax. The memory of those clawed footprints remained seared into my mind, along with the image of that massive shape moving with such unnatural grace through the trees. Whatever it was still out there, somewhere in the depths of the Idaho wilderness, and I had no intention of ever going back to find it. I returned to work at the ER the following week, finding comfort in the familiar chaos of the hospital. The screaming sirens and demanding patients no longer seemed so stressful, not compared to the absolute silence of that forest and the knowledge that something inexplicable stalked its depths. Sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm alone with my thoughts, I wonder about that creature. My medical training tells me to seek answers, to understand. But some things I've learned are better left in the darkness where they belong. I still have the photos of those tracks on my phone, though I rarely look at them. They serve as a reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of our rational modern world, waiting for unsuspecting people like me to stumble upon their domain. The wilderness has a way of teaching us humility, of showing us that despite all our knowledge and technology, we're not at the top of every food chain. I went to those woods seeking peace and quiet, but I found something else entirely, a mystery that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life, and a healthy respect for the unknown that no amount of medical training could have prepared me for. 3 months have passed since my encounter in Clearwater National Forest, and while I've tried to move on with my life, the experience has left an indelible mark on me. Last week I received an unexpected call from Sheriff Winters. 2 more hikers had reported similar encounters in the same area, and he wanted to know if I'd be willing to give a detailed statement to some researchers from the Idaho Department of Fish and Game who were investigating the incidents. I agreed. though recounting the experience made my palms sweat and my heart race. The researchers, Dr. Sarah Chen and Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, listened intently as I described every detail. They showed particular interest in my medical background, noting that my clinical observations of the creature's movements and behavior provided a unique perspective their other witnesses couldn't offer. Dr. Chen shared something that chilled me to my core. Analysis of soil samples from the area had revealed unusual patterns of wildlife avoidance, a scientific confirmation of what I'd noticed that day. Large swaths of the forest were completely devoid of the usual animal activity, as if every living creature knew to stay away. When I mentioned the fur I'd found and regrettably discarded, both researchers exchanged meaningful looks but refused to elaborate. I've since learned that the locals have stories about that part of the forest going back generations. They call it the dead zone, not because things die there, but because it feels lifeless, empty. The Native American tribes of the region reportedly avoided the area long before the logging companies arrived, though their reasons have been lost to time. My work in the ER continues, but I've changed. When patients come in with stories that seem impossible, I listen more carefully now. The world is stranger than my medical training led me to believe. And sometimes the most rational response to an encounter with the unknown is to simply acknowledge its mystery. I still have nightmares about that massive shape moving through the trees, about those intelligent eyes watching me from the darkness. But they're becoming less frequent. The camping gear remains untouched in my garage. I'm not ready to venture into the wilderness again, not yet. But sometimes, on clear nights when the city feels too confined, I find myself looking toward the mountains, wondering about what's out there. The fur I threw away haunts me most of all. It could have provided answers, or at least pointed toward them. Dr. Chen mentioned they've collected other samples from the area. Dark, coarse fur that doesn't match any known species in North America. The analysis is ongoing, she says, but the results so far have raised more questions than answers. Last month, I submitted my official report to the Idaho Wildlife Research Database. It sits there now, alongside dozens of others, each telling a similar story of encounters with something that shouldn't exist. The scientific part of me wants to understand, to classify and categorize this thing within our known natural world. But another part of me, the part that felt its presence in those woods, hopes we never do. Some mysteries, I've come to believe, serve a purpose. They remind us that despite our technological advances and medical breakthroughs, we're not so far removed from our ancestors who huddled around fires, telling stories of things that lurked in the dark. The only difference is that now, sometimes, we have photos of footprints to go along with our tales. I keep in touch with Sheriff Winters. He calls every few weeks with updates, though there's rarely anything new to report. The thing, whatever it is, seems to appear only when it wants to, leaving just enough evidence to make us question everything we think we know about the natural world. As for me, I found a strange peace in knowing that some questions don't have answers. My experiences in the ER taught me that not everything can be explained or fixed, and my encounter in the woods only reinforced that lesson. Sometimes the best we can do is acknowledge the mystery and respect its power. The Clearwater National Forest keeps its secrets, and maybe that's for the best. But if you ever find yourself driving those remote Idaho roads and come across a logging trail that leads deep into the woods, think twice before following it. Some parts of the wilderness don't want to be explored, and some things are better left undisturbed in the ancient darkness of the forest. My name is Walter Lee. What I'm about to tell you happened to me in September 2000, forever changing my life and my understanding of the world around us. Back then, I worked as a wildlife biologist in Yellowstone National Park, a job I had held for over 2 decades. Most days were filled with data tracking, trail maintenance, and other routine tasks that came with studying and preserving one of America's most cherished natural wonders. But there's a wildness to Yellowstone that seeps into your bones, a sense of something vast and untamed, and watching, always watching. It started with the mauled carcasses, elk mostly, but also the occasional bison or moose. The way they were taken down wasn't right. Not wolves, not bears, something else entirely, something that left even the most seasoned park rangers scratching their heads and muttering under their breath about things as old as the park itself. Whispers reached my ears, stories told by campers on the fringes of the park, of glimpses of something massive moving through the trees. They dismissed them as tall tales fueled by too many nights by the campfire and too much whiskey. Yet, standing alone in the dense forest we locals called Obsidian Forest, surrounded by the mutilated remains of creatures I thought I knew, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Then came the disappearances. A lone hiker on a backcountry trail vanished without a trace. Then 2 more. The official statement from the park was animal attacks, but the lack of any remains told a different story. Panic spread, and my quiet job suddenly thrust me into the heart of a full-blown manhunt. Word must have gotten up the chain because one morning a government jeep pulled up to my cabin. Inside were 2 men who didn't bother with Park Service uniforms. Their names were Mason and Reeves, and they cut to the chase. They were part of a special team brought in to handle the disappearances, and they wanted me to guide them. For 3 days, we traversed the wilderness. Mason, ex-military, all hard muscle and hard eyes. Reeves, a lean, nervous type who was more at home hunched over computers than in the great outdoors. And me, suddenly thrust into a world I'd never imagined despite a lifetime spent in the wilds. We tracked the coordinates of the most recent disappearance. The hiker, a young woman named Emily, had been broadcasting her location via a tracking app. Her trail ended abruptly at the base of a dense, overgrown valley, known to the locals as Dead Man's Gulch. It had an ominous ring for a reason. Old-timers claimed anyone who wandered in there didn't come out. The terrain was brutal, strewn with fallen trees and dense thickets. The GPS led us to a trampled campsite. Emily's pack lay torn open, but there was no sign of blood, no struggle. I led them deeper into the gulch, my steps hesitant. The air seemed to grow thicker, heavier, and an unnatural silence pressed in around us. Suddenly, Reeves shouted, pointing ahead. Wedged between 2 rocks was Emily's phone, crushed but still functional. He held it up, the cracked screen showing a blurry, pixelated image, the last thing the camera had captured before its destruction. We crowded close, our hearts pounding. The photo was grainy, half obscured by foliage, yet it was enough to make our blood run cold. Staring back at us was no animal. It was a massive bipedal shape, impossibly tall, hunched in the shadows. It had long, muscular limbs and a glint of eyes that burned with chilling intelligence. "What the hell is that?" Reeves hissed, his voice barely a whisper. Before anyone could answer, a scream echoed through the gulch. Not a human scream, but something deeper, wilder. There was only one source, Emily. She was still alive. "We have to find her," I hissed. We charged into the undergrowth, following the sound. I caught glimpses of the creature through the trees. It moved with unnatural speed, more ape than man, but far larger than anything I'd ever encountered. The pursuit led us deeper into the heart of Dead Man's Gulch, the ground growing steeper, rockier. We reached a sheer cliff, and at its base a cave entrance. On the ground outside was Emily's torn and bloody t-shirt. Mason made the call. "We're going in." Fear twisted my guts, but a primal determination overrode it. We drew our weapons, flashlights cutting through the gloom of the cave. The air was thick with a humid, earthy stench. Each step forward felt like walking into a predator's den. Then a noise from deeper inside the cave, a low guttural growl. It echoed back at us, multiplied, as if the creature knew we were here. We tensed, weapons raised. From the darkness it launched itself at us, a blur of fur, teeth, and claws. Reeves screamed and fired his rifle blindly. The creature was upon us, its roar deafening in the confined space. Mason unleashed a volley of shots, striking the creature and driving it back. But as it retreated, it snatched up Reeves in its massive clawed hand. Reeves screamed again, his cries cut short as the creature vanished back into the darkness with its prize. His rifle clattered to the cave floor, his flashlight rolled across the rocks, the beam trembling wildly before going dark. "Reeves!" Mason and I scrambled forward, but there was nothing in the darkness but an echoing silence. Fury surged through me. These things had been lurking in the park, preying on people, and now they had one of our own. Mason held up a hand, the universal sign to pause and listen. Silence hung in the air. Then, faintly, we heard a rustling, a muffled whimper from deeper within the cave system. Mason nodded at me, his eyes grim beneath the low beam of his flashlight. We were going after Reeves. The cave tunnels wound downwards, the air growing denser, and the foul stench intensifying. We stalked forward, rifles raised, our flashlights cutting through the suffocating blackness. The whimpers grew louder, urging us on. Suddenly we burst into a large natural cavern, the ceiling studded with dimly luminescent rock formations. And there, chained to the far wall with thick metal chains, was Reeves. He was slumped in a corner, ragged breaths heaving from his chest. He was alive, but his eyes were vacant with terror. Before we could react, the creature reappeared, dropping from the ceiling in a flurry of darkness and claws. Mason opened fire, forcing it back. I sprinted towards Reeves, ignoring the enraged screeching, the glint of teeth. The chains were heavy, secured with a thick padlock. My fingers fumbled for my toolkit, desperately searching for the bolt cutters. Time seemed to stretch. Each tick of the second was a hammer blow to my nerves. The creature stalked closer, circling us. A single swipe of its claws would tear me apart. Mason kept it pinned with a relentless barrage of gunfire, forcing it back again and again. With a gasp of triumph, I snapped the padlock, and the chains fell away. I half-dragged, half-carried Reeves as we made a desperate scramble back towards the cave entrance. The echoing gunshots and the creature's howls of rage fueled our flight. We burst back into the light of day, collapsing beside the cliff. Mason slammed the heavy stone that served as a makeshift door shut behind us, barring the entrance. Silence fell, save for our ragged breaths and Reeves' ragged sobs. We'd escaped, but at a terrible cost. I looked down at Dead Man's Gulch, now bathed in the soft glow of sunset. It felt like the wilderness itself was staring back accusingly. The aftermath was a whirlwind. More soldiers arrived, armed to the teeth. They sealed off the entire area. We were debriefed in a hastily erected field camp. Our descriptions of the creature met with stony-faced nods. It was clear they knew more than they were letting on. We never went back inside that cave. A week later, a controlled detonation was ordered. The muffled blast echoed through the valley, followed by an ominous silence. When I asked what they'd found, Mason just looked at me and said, "We found enough." The incident was hushed up. The missing hikers were ruled as unfortunate wildlife encounters. No mention was made of the creature, of the cave, of Reeves. Officially, he never existed. For Mason and me, there was no going back to a normal life. We'd seen the shadows in the park, the things lurking beyond the flickering edges of civilization. We were recruited into a new unit, its existence hidden behind layers of government bureaucracy. We became hunters of the unknown, tracking creatures most people dismissed as myth. They sent us into remote corners of the country, places where unexplained sightings and disappearances made the news, then were promptly forgotten. I faced horrors I never could have imagined, stared into eyes that hold no trace of humanity. It's a solitary life spent on the fringes of society. Mason jokes that we're the real monsters out there in the darkness. He's not entirely wrong. Sometimes I look in the mirror and don't recognize the man staring back at me. The worst part isn't the creatures we hunt. It's the knowledge of how much more lurks out there, the things the government knows about and keeps hidden. The world most people see is just a thin veneer, and beneath it, well, let's just say I don't tell campfire stories anymore. There's always a new trail to follow, some new mystery in the heart of forgotten wilderness. I tell myself I do this to protect people, but another part of me knows I'm searching for something. Absolution, maybe. Or perhaps deep down, part of me believes that one day I'll wander into some godforsaken corner of the world and find Reeves, alive. Unlikely, I know. But out in the places where the wild things dwell, hope is a rare and precious thing. You have to cling to it, or you might end up like the creatures you hunt. As I write this, I'm preparing for another mission. There have been reports of strange occurrences in a remote forest in the Pacific Northwest, hikers going missing, bizarre animal behavior, and whispers of something ancient awakening in the depths of the woods. I don't know what we'll find there, but I know this. The shadows are growing longer, and the things that lurk in the dark are getting bolder. The line between myth and reality is blurring, and we're the only ones standing in the breach. If you're reading this, consider it a warning. The wilderness isn't just trees and animals. There are things out there, older than humanity, with appetites we can't comprehend. And they're watching us. Always watching. So the next time you're in the great outdoors and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being observed, trust your instincts, because you never know what might be lurking just beyond the tree line, waiting for its chance to strike. As for me, I'll keep hunting. It's all I know now. And maybe, just maybe, one day I'll find the answers I'm looking for. Or maybe I'll disappear into the wilderness, becoming just another mystery for someone else to solve. Either way, the shadows of Obsidian Forest will always be with me, a constant reminder of the day I learned that some legends are all too real. My name is Frank Morgan, and I am 68 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on October 17, 2014, deep in the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It's a tale that's haunted me ever since, one that's changed the course of my life and shaken everything I thought I knew about the world around us. I've been working these woods my whole life, just like my poppy before me. The Morgan family has been a fixture in these parts for generations, our roots as deep as the ancient trees that blanket these misty hills. I knew them trails like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. Figured after all these years, nothing could surprise me anymore. Guess I was wrong about that. It was a crisp autumn morning when I got the call. Sally, the dispatcher down at Ranger Station, her voice tight with worry. "Frank, we've got a situation. 2 college kids, weekend camping trip. They've gone off the grid." Now, folks get lost up in these mountains all the time. Usually, it's nothing more than a case of city slickers underestimating the terrain, wandering off trail and ending up turned around. But something in Sally's tone set me on edge. "What's different about this one, Sal?" I asked, already reaching for my boots. "It's been 3 days, Frank. No sign of their gear, no sign of them at all. Not a trace. Search teams have combed the lower elevations. Nothing." That set off alarm bells. In my experience, even the most inexperienced hikers leave some kind of trail. A dropped water bottle, a scrap of clothing caught on a branch, something. Any chance they just packed up and left? Decided to extend their trip without telling anyone? Sally's sigh crackled over the line. "Their car's still at the trailhead. Frank, there's something else. A couple of hikers reported hearing strange noises up in the high country. Said it didn't sound like any animal they recognized." My mind started racing. Was some drifter or escaped con hiding out up there, preying on the unwary? It wouldn't be the first time these mountains harbored dangerous fugitives. but my gut told me this was something different. "All right, Sal, I'm heading in. Put together a team, seasoned folks only. We're going up into the higher elevations where they were last seen." "Already on it. They'll meet you at the North Creek trailhead in an hour. Frank, be careful out there." I hung up, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. As I gathered my gear, my eyes fell on the old shotgun mounted above the fireplace. After a moment's hesitation, I took it down, checking the action. Better to have it and not need it, I told myself. Little did I know I'd need every weapon I could get my hands on before this was over. The team assembled at the trailhead was a mix of seasoned park rangers and local search and rescue volunteers. I recognized most of them. These mountains were a small community, after all. There was Tom Hawkins, a strapping young ranger in his early 30s, eager and full of energy. Beth Cooper, one of our most experienced trackers, her weathered face set in grim determination. Jensen McBride, a local hunter who knew these hills almost as well as I did. We went in packing heavy rifles, emergency supplies, the works. This wasn't some casual hike to find a couple of lost Boy Scouts. The mood was tense as we set off, the weight of our mission hanging over us like the low-lying clouds that cloaked the mountaintops. The first few miles were uneventful, our boots crunching through fallen leaves as we ascended into the higher elevations. But as we climbed, the forest around us seemed to change. The familiar trails took on an alien quality, the trees pressing in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. "Frank!" Beth called out, her voice hushed. "Take a look at this." She was crouched by a thicket of rhododendron, examining something on the ground. As I approached, I saw what had caught her attention, a set of tracks unlike anything I'd seen before. They were huge, easily twice the size of a bear print, with strange elongated toes and deep claw marks. "What do you make of it?" Tom asked, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on his holstered sidearm. I shook my head, a cold feeling settling in my gut. "I don't rightly know, but whatever made these, it's big, and it's not supposed to be here." We pressed on, the mood growing more somber with each passing hour. The woods felt heavy, the air thick even for autumn. It was as if the very forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As dusk approached, we made camp in a narrow valley, intending to continue the search at daybreak. After a meager dinner of trail rations, I decided to take a perimeter walk. Old ranger habits die hard, and something about this place had me on edge. I strayed a little ways from the firelight, just scanning the tree line. That's when I heard it. A rustling sound, then a low, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't any animal I recognized, too deep for a cougar, too guttural for a bear. Back at camp, everyone was asleep. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Probably some half-starved coyote. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of hostile eyes tracking my every move from the impenetrable darkness beyond our little circle of light. I spent the rest of the night listening to the symphony of crickets, punctuated by the occasional snap of a branch, the hoot of an owl, and something else. Something that sounded far too big, far too close for comfort. The next morning broke cold and clear, a layer of frost coating the ground and a thin mist rising from the valley floor. As we broke camp, I could see the strain of the night's unease etched on everyone's faces. No one had slept well, it seemed. We began our search again, spreading out to cover more ground. Hours passed without a sign of the missing campers. I found myself gravitating to the areas most overgrown, the tangled thickets of rhododendron and mountain laurel. Something told me these kids hadn't wandered far from where they began. By midday, Tom and Beth were getting jumpy. They'd heard those noises too, swore they saw shadows just out of sight. It wasn't their imaginations. I'd seen them too. Dark shapes flitting between the trees, always at the edge of vision, gone when you tried to focus on them. "Frank," Jensen called out, his voice tight, "you need to see this." We gathered around a small clearing. The ground was torn up, deep furrows gouged into the earth. Scattered around were scraps of fabric, a torn backpack, shreds of what might have been a tent, and blood. Not much, but enough to know something violent had happened here. "Jesus," Tom whispered. "What could have done this?" Before I could answer, a scream split the air. It came from the direction Beth had wandered off in. We took off running, crashing through the underbrush, hearts pounding. We found Beth backed up against a massive oak, her face pale as a sheet. She pointed with a trembling hand to a gap in the foliage. There, half hidden by shadows, was something. For a moment my mind went blank, unable to process what I was seeing. This thing was a nightmare made flesh, standing at least 9 feet tall, caked in mud and who knows what else. It was impossibly strong-looking, muscles rippling beneath a coat of thick black fur. The head was hard to describe, small and hunched forward, with a flat, protruding snout and tiny black eyes full of predatory cunning. It roared, bearing rows of vicious teeth, and that's when the smell hit me, like rotting meat and something altogether fouler, a stench that made my eyes water and my stomach heave. "Fall back!" I shouted, raising my rifle and firing off warning shots. The thing flinched, then charged forward, its speed terrifying for something so large. We fell back in disarray, firing as we went. The creature barreled forward, heedless of the gunfire. It lunged at Beth, its clawed hand the size of a bear trap raking across her torso. She screamed, then crumpled to the ground. Chaos erupted. Shots rang out and the creature let out an enraged roar. I saw it grab Tom, tossing him aside like a broken doll. Then, as suddenly as it had materialized, it was gone, vanishing into the undergrowth with impossible agility for its size. I sprinted to Beth, the world blurring around me. Blood soaked through my hands as I tried to stop the bleeding. Her eyes stared lifelessly up at the sky, unseeing. Tom's fate wasn't much better. He lay sprawled against a tree, legs mangled, neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Only Jensen had escaped unscathed, his face pale with shock. The 3 of us were all that remained of the search party, left staring at the mangled remains of our comrades. The creature had moved off, but it could be anywhere, watching us, stalking, waiting. We radioed for backup, our voices trembling. But who the hell would believe us? Ranger deaths, sure. Animal attack, maybe. But a hulking, unidentified monster that shrugged off gunfire like it was nothing. We'd be lucky if they didn't ship us off to the psych ward. Backup came, of course. Armed support, even a chopper circling overhead. But what they didn't find was the creature. They found the bodies, the campsite ransacked, and the remnants of an animal carcass nearby, torn to bloody ribbons. They also found footprints, huge prints unlike anything in the official wildlife guides. The official report went with mountain lion attack. Easier to swallow, I suppose. Easier to avoid the media frenzy and uncomfortable questions about what else might be lurking out there in the dark corners of the wilderness. It didn't bring back Beth or Tom. Didn't change the fact that whatever we encountered that day wasn't natural. Wasn't simply part of the ecosystem we thought we understood. They told me to take leave, said I was suffering from shock, trauma. Maybe they were right, but I couldn't sit still. Couldn't forget the creature's malevolent glare, the sickening reek of its fur. Couldn't forget Beth's last terrified scream, or the way Tom's body had been tossed aside like a rag doll. I left the mountains for a while, drifted, did odd jobs, but the nightmares followed me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the creature's roar echoing in my ears, the stench of its fur burning my nostrils. I tried to drown it out, with whiskey, with work, with anything I could find. Nothing helped. Months passed. I was a shell of my former self, haunted by what I'd seen, by the knowledge that something was out there, something that defied explanation. And then one day, I saw it. A small article, buried in the back pages of a local paper. Another disappearance, another search party baffled. This time in the Ozarks. It was like a spark igniting in my brain. I knew deep in my bones that it was connected, that whatever had killed Beth and Tom wasn't an isolated incident. It was happening again. That's when I made my decision. I couldn't go back to my old life. Couldn't pretend that the world was the same place I'd always thought it was. But I could do something. I could hunt this thing, could try to stop it from happening to anyone else. I'm back in the game now, not working as a ranger anymore, at least not officially. I patrol different wilderness areas, the sprawling forests and swamplands, chasing rumors of hunters disappearing, hikers vanishing without a trace. I leave notes, warnings for those brave enough or foolish enough to venture into the deepest parts of the backcountry. Beware, predator at large. Someone has to do it. Someone has to stand between the innocent and the things that lurk in the shadows. It's a lonely existence, a thankless one. And one of these days that creature or one of its kin will find me again. I know that. But until then, I'll keep searching, keep warning, because it's an ugly world sometimes. But even the ugliest truths need to be brought to light. My pursuit became an obsession, consuming every waking moment. I'd spot a story in the local papers, an unexplained disappearance in some remote corner of the country, and I'd be on the road before the ink was dry. Each new location offered a twisted puzzle. Tracks defying identification, half-eaten animal carcasses with tooth marks no known predator could have made. The lingering whispers of terrified witnesses who'd glimpsed something they couldn't quite explain. I'd camp alone in the woods for weeks at a time, my senses always on high alert, waiting for the slightest hint of movement, the faintest whiff of that putrid musk in the air. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'd hear that bone-chilling roar echoing across distant ridgelines. It was out there, always just one step ahead of me. I started keeping even more detailed records. I meticulously cataloged each encounter, each footprint or shredded campsite. I cross-referenced the sightings, mapped likely hunting ranges. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. These creatures, whatever they were, weren't random in their movements. There was intelligence behind their actions, a chilling method to their savagery. They showed a clear preference for dense, old-growth forest, areas where the canopy blotted out the sun and the underbrush grew thick and tangled. They seemed to stick to the fringes of civilization, places where the encroachment of human development butted up against true wilderness. And they were adapting, learning. With each passing year, they grew bolder, venturing closer to populated areas, their attacks becoming more frequent and more brazen. The obsession came at a cost. What few relationships I had left unraveled. Anyone who stuck around long enough saw the haunted look in my eyes, the way I'd jump at every creaking floorboard or rustle of leaves. My savings dwindled, replaced by a collection of worn trail boots, battered binoculars, and a shotgun that rarely left my side. But it didn't matter. This was bigger than any one person, bigger than my own comfort or safety. I was on the trail of something that threatened the very fabric of what we thought we knew about the natural world. And I couldn't let it go. Not until I had answers. One trail led me north, way up into the isolated forests along the U.S.-Canadian border. The locals spoke in hushed tones of something stalking the woods, of livestock vanishing and hunters going missing. I knew I was close. It was there I met Hank, a wiry, weathered old trapper who'd spent his entire life in these parts. At first he was skeptical of my wild tales, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, of fear, that told me he'd seen things too, things he couldn't explain. Over a bottle of whiskey one night, the story came spilling out. Hank swore he'd seen something monstrous up on the ridgeline above his cabin, something that snatched one of his traps clean off its chain, a trap that could hold a grizzly. "Weren't no bear," Hank muttered, his gnarled hands clutching his glass. "Weren't nothing natural at all. Had eyes that glowed in the dark, I tell you. Smart, too. Like it knew I was watching." We spent the next week up in those woods, laying out extra traps, setting up trail cameras, waiting for the creature to return. The forest felt different up here. Older, wilder. The trees grew close together, their branches intertwining to create a canopy so thick that even at midday, the forest floor was cloaked in perpetual twilight. It returned on the fourth night. I woke to Hank's panicked shouts and the staccato burst of gunfire ripping through the darkness. I scrambled out of my tent, sleep-fogged and disoriented, fumbling for my rifle. The clearing in front of Hank's cabin was a scene of utter chaos. Hank was slumped against the porch, already gone, his chest ripped open by monstrous claws. One of the creatures, the same massive brute I remembered from the Smokies, stood over his body, blood dripping from its fangs. It turned, pinning me in the glare of those beady, malevolent eyes. But it wasn't alone. A younger, smaller creature flanked it, its fur dappled with Hank's fresh blood. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me. They were breeding, expanding their numbers. Rage and grief ignited within me. This was personal now. Hank had been a friend, one of the few who believed me, who understood the gravity of what we were facing. I raised my rifle and fired, a desperate act of defiance against these nightmares made flesh. The bigger creature snarled, swiping a massive paw in my direction. I dove for cover, rolling behind the remains of Hank's woodshed. Splinters flew as the creature demolished the structure with brute force. I was pinned down, heart pounding like a war drum in my chest. Another gunshot rang out, and the younger creature cried out in pain. I risked a glance and saw it limping away into the trees, a streak of red trailing behind. One down, at least, but the larger one, the real threat, was still focused on ripping me to shreds. Just when I thought it was over, hope flared. A vehicle roared up the dirt path leading to the cabin, headlights cutting through the darkness. Two figures leaped out, armed to the teeth. They shouted that they were here to help, that they'd heard the commotion. For a fleeting second, I believed salvation had arrived. But something was wrong. Their movements were jerky, awkward, their expressions fixed in a way that seemed off. Then I noticed their eyes, gleaming in the moonlight. Those same small, black, unnaturally intelligent eyes I'd seen in the creatures. Horror washed over me as I realized the truth. These weren't rescuers. They were more of those things, wearing human skin like a grotesque disguise. They'd evolved, adapted, found a way to hide in plain sight. I opened my mouth to shout a warning, but it was too late. The two newcomers turned their guns on me. The first shot slammed into my shoulder, sending me sprawling. Pain exploded through my body as I hit the ground hard. The hulking creature was closing in, sensing my vulnerability, relishing the kill. This was it. After all those years, all those solitary miles, it would end not with a hero's stand, but a desperate demise in this remote, blood-soaked clearing. Then, as if called from a nightmare, a new sound split the air. It started as a low rumble, rising to a deep, ground-shaking roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The creatures, including the one closing in on me, froze, confusion replacing their bloodlust. From the shadows emerged a bear. But not just any bear. This was a behemoth, easily twice the size of the largest grizzly I'd ever seen. Its broad chest heaved with each breath, claws the length of machetes glinting in the moonlight. But it was the eyes that truly chilled me, blazing with not just animal fury, but a chilling primal intelligence. It charged the creatures with another ear-splitting roar, moving with a speed that belied its massive size. The bear was a blur of fur and teeth, its attacks precise and devastating. One of the disguised creatures barely had time to raise its gun before the bear ripped it apart in a spray of blood and gore. The other fled, scrambling for its truck in blind panic. The monstrous creature that had stalked me, the killer of Beth and Tom and now Hank, hesitated for a moment. Then, driven by some primal instinct, it turned to face this new threat. What followed was a clash of titans, a battle that shook the very earth beneath my feet. The two monsters tore into each other with a savagery that defied description. Trees splintered under the force of their blows, the clearing echoing with roars of pain and fury. I scrambled to my feet, my wounded shoulder screaming in protest, and watched in awe as nature itself seemed to rebel against the aberration that had invaded it. The newcomer's truck sputtered to life, its tires spinning as it disappeared down the dirt track. I fumbled with my rifle, but the fight raged beyond my ability to intervene. This was their battle now, forces of nature beyond human comprehension. In the end, it was over almost as quickly as it had begun. The creature, for all its terrifying strength, lay crumpled on the blood-soaked ground. The giant bear stood above it, breathing heavily, a fresh gash across its flank the only sign of the ferocious fight. It turned its massive head and looked directly at me. In that moment, I felt a surge of understanding wash over me. This bear, this impossibly large protector of the wilds, was connected to those creatures in some way I couldn't fully grasp. It was part of some ancient balance, a guardian of the old ways rising to meet a threat to the natural order. The bear lumbered away, disappearing back into the trees with the same eerie silence with which it had appeared. I stood there, shaking, my world tilted on its axis. As dawn spilled over the clearing, I saw the damage in stark light, Hank's lifeless form, the monstrous corpses, some still unsettlingly human-like, the remnants of a battle that defied understanding. The aftermath is a blur in my memory. I made the call, gave a report filled with half-truths and evasions. Bear attack, I said. Unknown assailants. More lies to cover up a truth too dangerous, too paradigm-shattering to tell. They came, of course. Rangers, police, even some men in dark suits who never gave their names. They buried Hank and cleaned up the clearing, sanitizing the scene into something explainable, something easy to forget. But I knew the truth, and it weighed on me like a physical thing. In the days and weeks that followed, I pored over my notes, connecting dots I'd never seen before. The creatures, the bear, they were all part of something bigger, something older than humanity itself, a hidden world existing alongside our own, occasionally bleeding through in ways we couldn't comprehend. I continued to wander, following the trail of blood and whispers. But that battle up north changed me. Now I'm not just a hunter, but a witness to a hidden world, a keeper of secrets too dangerous for the public to know. My quest isn't about killing those creatures anymore. It's about learning, about understanding the forces at play out there in the dark places of the world. And maybe, just maybe, finding a way for all of us, human and other, to survive together in this world that's far stranger and more terrifying than we ever imagined. I've seen things that would shatter most people's sanity. I've faced monsters both inhuman and all too human. But I've also glimpsed wonders beyond description, caught fleeting visions of a world far more complex and beautiful than we realize. So I keep moving, keep searching, because someone needs to stand watch, to be the sentinel between two worlds. And if that someone has to be a broken-down old ranger with too many miles on his boots and too many ghosts in his past, well, so be it. The wilderness is vast and night is falling. There's work to be done. I've always known there was something different about the Black Ridge Woods. Not in the way city folks talk about nature being magical or peaceful. They've never spent a winter night listening to the wind howl through the pines like a dying thing, or watch the shadows move when there's nothing there to cast them. These woods have teeth, and I learned young how to avoid getting bitten. My name's James Hawkins. though most folks around here just call me Hawk. Been living in these parts for 43 years, following in my father's footsteps as a trapper and guide. Pa wasn't what you'd call a conventional teacher. While other kids were learning their ABCs, I was learning which mushrooms would feed you and which would make your heart stop. He'd take me deep into the forest before dawn, teaching me to read the story written in broken twigs and disturbed leaves. Nature speaks its own language, he'd say, and a man's life depends on learning to listen. Those lessons weren't always gentle. When I was 12, Pa left me alone in the woods for 3 days with nothing but a knife and the clothes on my back. Said it was time I learned what the forest had to teach. I still remember that first night, huddled in a hollow log while something big circled my makeshift shelter, breathing heavy and slow. Never did see what it was, but I learned right quick about respect. The woods don't care about your plans or your pride. They've got their own rules, written in a script older than words. That's how I came to know the regulars in these parts. Old Bill Mason, who runs the general store in town, and always seems to know when a storm's coming before the weather service does. Sarah Thompson, our sheriff now, tough as old leather but fair-minded. We're a tight-knit bunch, us edge-dwellers. Have to be. Town folks think we're backwards, calling us mountain people like it's some kind of insult. But we know better. We're the ones who remember the old ways, the ones who still know how to listen when the woods speak. I made my living as a guide mostly, taking wealthy hunters into the backcountry after deer or elk. Some years back, I started doing survival training too. City people paying good money to learn what Pa taught me for free. Funny how things work out. But it kept me in ammunition and coffee and let me stay where I belonged. The woods were my home, my workplace, my church, all rolled into one. Looking back now, I should have noticed the signs sooner. The way the birds went quiet in mid-song. How the deer started avoiding their usual watering holes. Even the black bears, usually bold as brass when it came to raiding camping sites, disappeared almost overnight. Nature was trying to tell us something, but I'd grown too comfortable, too sure of my place in these woods. Pride makes a man deaf to warnings, Pa used to say, and I was about to learn just how right he'd been. It started with the dreams. Not nightmares exactly, but the kind of dreams that leave you drenched in sweat, heart hammering against your ribs like it's trying to escape. Dreams of something moving through the trees at night, something that walked like a man but wasn't, something that knew my name. I'd wake up to find my hunting dog, Duke, growling at the darkness beyond my cabin windows, his hackles raised and teeth bared at shadows I couldn't quite see. I'd been alone in these woods for so long, I'd forgotten what real fear felt like. But I was about to remember. And the lessons that followed would change everything I thought I knew about these ancient forests and the secrets they keep buried in their depths. Planning a serious trek into the deep woods isn't like taking a walk in some city park. Every ounce you carry could mean the difference between life and death, especially when you're tracking something unknown. I spent 3 days gathering supplies, checking and double-checking my gear. My old Remington 700 got a thorough cleaning, though something in my gut told me regular bullets might not be enough this time. I pulled out my father's journal, leather-bound and weather-beaten, its pages yellow with age. Pa had been more than just a hunter. He was a keeper of old knowledge, the kind that gets passed down in whispers around campfires. Between detailed notes about animal tracks and weather patterns were stranger things, drawings of creatures that shouldn't exist, warnings about places in the woods where the shadows fell wrong. Sarah Thompson stopped by while I was preparing. She'd known my father, respected him more than most. "Hawk," she said, leaning against my porch rail. "Word's getting around about strange things in the high country. Hikers gone missing up near Devil's Backbone, found their camp torn apart like something was looking for something specific." She paused, studying my face. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" I told her about the dreams, about Duke's behavior, about the unnatural quiet that had settled over my section of the woods. She listened without interrupting, her face growing grimmer with each detail. When I finished, she pulled something from her jacket, a file folder thick with reports spanning decades. "Your father kept records too," she said quietly. "Things he saw out there that didn't make sense, things that followed patterns we're seeing again now." The reports painted a disturbing picture. Every 30 years or so, the woods seemed to wake up. People would vanish. Animals would be found mutilated in ways that defied natural predators. And always, there would be tracks, huge prints that started like a bear's but changed, becoming more human-like before vanishing entirely. The morning I set out, the forest was wrapped in a fog so thick it seemed to swallow sound itself. Duke stuck close to my heels, which was unusual for him. Normally he'd be ranging ahead, nose to the ground, but something had him spooked. The weight of my pack pressed against my shoulders, each item carefully chosen. Emergency medical supplies, 3 days of concentrated food, water purification tablets, extra ammunition, and my father's journal. The trail I chose wasn't on any official map. It wound up through the hills like a snake, following game trails and old logging roads that nature had mostly reclaimed. As we climbed higher, the vegetation changed. The familiar oaks and maples gave way to darker evergreens, their branches hanging low and heavy with moss. The air grew thinner but also heavier somehow, like it was charged with electricity before a storm. By mid-afternoon, I knew something was wrong. The forest floor was littered with dead birds, dozens of them, their bodies intact but lifeless, as if they'd simply fallen from the sky. Duke wouldn't go near them. He kept whining, pulling at his leash to head back down the mountain. I'd never seen him act like this, not in all our years together. Then I found the first real evidence that we weren't alone. A clearing that shouldn't have been there. Trees pushed outward from the center like something massive had landed or emerged. The ground was scorched in a perfect circle, and in the middle, half buried in the earth, was a deer carcass. But this wasn't any normal predator kill. The animal had been turned inside out, its organs arranged in a deliberate pattern around the body. The precision of it was almost surgical. I knelt to examine the scene closer, my hand instinctively tightening on my rifle. The blood was fresh, couldn't have been more than a few hours old. That's when I noticed the silence. No birds, no insects, not even the wind in the trees. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The sun was setting faster than it should have been, shadows stretching like grasping fingers across the ground. I knew I should make camp, but something drove me forward. Each step took me deeper into territory that felt increasingly wrong. The trees grew denser, their trunks twisted into unnatural shapes. Some seemed to face me as I passed, though I told myself it was just tricks of the light. Duke's whining had turned to a constant low growl. His hackles were raised, head swiveling from side to side as we pushed forward. The temperature had dropped dramatically, my breath coming out in visible puffs despite it being middle of summer. The air felt thick, almost gelatinous, like walking through invisible spider webs. That's when we found the cave. It wasn't marked on any map, and I'd swear it hadn't been there last season. The entrance was perfectly round, as if something had melted its way through the rock. Warm air flowed out of it, carrying a smell that made my nose burn, like rotting meat mixed with ozone after a lightning strike. I don't know what possessed me to enter that cave. Maybe it was foolish courage, or maybe something was calling me in. The beam of my flashlight seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, illuminating only a few feet ahead. Duke refused to follow, planting himself at the entrance with a whimper. The tunnel descended at a steep angle, the walls smooth and slightly warm to the touch. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. My flashlight began to flicker, and that's when I heard it. A sound no human throat could make, like metal scraping against metal, but somehow organic, alive. I swung my light toward the sound and saw it. It stood 9 feet tall, its body a nightmare collection of angles that shouldn't exist. The skin, if you could call it that, shifted like oil on water, never settling on one color or texture. But it was the face, or rather faces, that broke something in my mind. Dozens of them, human and animal, rippling across its surface like reflections in disturbed water. Some I recognized, missing hikers from over the years, a few local hunters who'd vanished without trace. Then it moved. It didn't walk or run. It folded, like paper being creased by invisible hands, covering the distance between us in an instant. The smell hit me first, like burning plastic and decay. My flashlight died completely, but I could still see it. It generated its own light, a sickly phosphorescence that pulsed in rhythm with what I guessed was a heartbeat. I fired my rifle. The sound was deafening in the confined space, but the creature didn't flinch. The bullets passed through it like it was smoke, leaving brief holes that sealed themselves instantly. It reached for me with limbs that bent in impossible ways, fingers splitting and multiplying like fractal patterns. I ran. I wish I could say it was a conscious decision, but my body moved on pure instinct. I dropped my rifle, dropped my pack, and ran faster than I've ever run in my life. Behind me, that terrible scraping sound grew louder, accompanied by a high-pitched keening that made my teeth vibrate. The tunnel seemed longer going out than coming in. My lungs burned, muscles screaming as I scrambled upward. I could feel it behind me, getting closer. The air grew colder wherever it passed, like it was sucking the heat out of the world itself. Duke's barking guided me to the entrance. The setting sun nearly blinded me as I burst out of the cave, but I didn't stop. My dog fell in beside me as we crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. That's when the trees began to move. The forest came alive around us. Trees didn't just sway, they twisted, their branches reaching down like grasping hands. Roots erupted from the ground, trying to tangle my feet. The thing behind us made that awful scraping sound again, and I swear the trees responded, bending away from it like they were afraid too. Duke and I crashed through the undergrowth, taking paths that shouldn't have existed moments before. The sky had gone wrong. Where there should have been sunset, there was now just a sickly green twilight that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My lungs were on fire, legs moving on pure adrenaline. Then Duke yelped. I turned to see a root wrapped around his back leg. Without thinking, I pulled my hunting knife and hacked at it. The wood screamed, actually screamed, and black sap that looked too much like blood spurted from the cut. I scooped up my dog and ran. The thing behind us was getting closer. I could feel its presence like a cold weight pressing against my back. The faces in its surface were screaming now, a chorus of voices begging for help, for mercy, for death. Some called my name in voices I recognized, people who'd gone missing over the years. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I don't remember exactly how we made it back to the cabin. Everything after sunset is a blur of motion and terror. I remember crashing through the door, Duke still in my arms. Remember slamming it shut, throwing every lock, pushing furniture against it. The windows, I boarded them up with shaking hands, nailing blankets over the boards. The thing stayed outside, circling. I could hear it moving, that terrible scraping sound growing closer, then farther, then closer again. Duke huddled under my bed, whimpering. I sat in the corner with my backup rifle across my knees, though I knew now it would be useless. It was the longest night of my life. Sometimes I heard voices, my father's, old friends, even my own, calling from the darkness. The thing was trying to lure me out. Around 3 a.m, the temperature dropped so low my breath frosted in the air. The walls creaked and groaned like they were being pressed from all sides. Just before dawn, everything went silent. The pressure lifted. When the sun finally rose, I waited another hour before looking outside. The clearing around my cabin was different. The trees had moved. They formed a perfect circle now, their trunks twisted and scarred. The ground was covered in strange marks. Not footprints exactly, but places where reality seemed to have folded in on itself, leaving creases in the earth. The following weeks were hard. I couldn't sleep without seeing those faces, hearing those voices. Duke wouldn't go more than a few feet from the cabin, and he'd lost all his joy for hunting. I found myself jumping at shadows, flinching at every creaking branch. Sarah Thompson came by after I missed our weekly check-in. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, then showed me something that made my blood run cold. Satellite photos of the area spanning 30 years. Every 3 decades, the same pattern appeared. Trees arranged in perfect circles, moving outward from that cave like ripples in a pond. "Your father saw it too," she said finally. "Left notes about it in a locked drawer at the station. Said it was getting stronger, spreading further each cycle. Said it wasn't just one thing up there. It was like a tear in the world, letting something through." I asked her why she hadn't told me before. She just looked at me with tired eyes. "Would you have believed me? Some things a person has to see for themselves. But now you know why we don't go up past Devil's Backbone after dark. Why we keep the old ways, the old warnings. That was 5 years ago. I still live in my cabin, still trap and hunt, but never alone now. Duke passed last winter, peacefully in his sleep. But I've got a new dog, a big German shepherd named Rex. He's good company, and he knows which parts of the woods to avoid. The thing in the cave hasn't shown itself since that night, but I know it's still there. Sometimes I see signs, dead birds arranged in patterns, trees that move between one visit and the next. The cave itself has vanished, the entrance sealed like it never existed, but the air still feels wrong up there. Thick, waiting. I've started teaching survival classes again, but different now. I teach people to read the woods, really read them. Not just tracking and foraging, but the old knowledge, which trails to avoid when the moon is full, why you should never whistle after dark, how to recognize when a patch of forest isn't quite right. Most folks think I'm just spinning tales, adding atmosphere to their wilderness experience. That's fine. Better they think I'm just a superstitious old mountain man than know the truth. But some of them, the ones who've spent enough time in these woods, who felt that watchful presence in the dark, they understand. Last week I found fresh tracks up near where the cave used to be. Not animal, not human, but something in between. The trees are starting to twist again, very slowly, very slightly, but I recognize the pattern. 25 years to go before the next cycle. I'll be too old to face it by then, but I've started keeping my own journal like my father did, recording everything I've seen, everything I know. The woods have teeth and they're always hungry. But if you know how to listen, if you know how to read the signs, you can avoid being bitten. Most days, anyway. I still dream about that thing sometimes. Its impossible angles, its faces, the way it moved like reality was optional. But I've made my peace with it as much as anyone can. Because here's the truth I've learned. We think we've tamed these woods, mapped every inch, named every species. But there are older things here, things that were ancient when the first humans walked these hills, things that will be here long after we're gone. The best we can do is remember the old ways, respect the old boundaries, and hope that when darkness falls, we're on the right side of the tree line. Some nights, sitting on my porch with Rex, watching the shadows lengthen between the trees, I think I understand what my father meant about the forest speaking its own language. It's not just the rustle of leaves or the cry of birds. It's something older, something that lives in the spaces between heartbeats. And if you listen carefully, very carefully, you can hear it whispering. The woods have teeth, and they remember. The desert has a way of changing a person. After 5 years working as a ranch hand outside Marfa, Texas, I'd grown accustomed to the vast emptiness, The way the land stretched out endlessly in every direction, like an ocean of dust and scrub brush. Name's Russell James Hawkins, though everyone just calls me Rusty, on account of my hair and my tendency to keep old trucks running long past their expiration date. I'd come to Marfa back in '89, fresh out of a failed marriage in Houston and looking for something, anything different. The Silver Creek Ranch was hiring, and I figured manual labor might help quiet the thoughts that kept me up at night. Owner was Tom McAllister, a third-generation rancher with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much sun. He took me on despite my obvious city background, saying he preferred someone willing to learn over someone who thought they knew it all. Those first few years were an education in themselves. I learned the rhythm of ranch life, the pre-dawn starts, the long days mending fences under the merciless Texas sun, the quiet evenings watching stars emerge in a sky so vast it made you feel like a speck of dust. The other hands taught me what I needed to know, how to track strays, predict weather from cloud patterns, and most importantly, how to respect the desert's moods. Marfa wasn't like other towns. Even before the incident, there was something different about it. Artists and tourists would drive through, drawn by stories of the mysterious Marfa lights, those unexplained orbs that danced on the horizon. Local bars buzzed with tales of UFO sightings, of strange creatures glimpsed in the darkness between the stars. I'd laugh along with the other ranch hands, dismissing them as tall tales meant to attract tourists. The old-timers, though, they took these stories seriously. Manuel Ramirez, who'd worked the ranch for 30 years, would cross himself whenever the lights were mentioned. El desierto guarda secretos, he'd say in his quiet way. The desert keeps secrets. I didn't understand then why his voice would drop to a whisper, or why he refused to ride out alone after sunset. There was this unspoken rule among the long-time residents. You didn't mess with certain places after dark. The old windmill out by the Carson property, the abandoned mercury mine 20 miles south, the dried-up creek bed where they'd found those bones back in '73, bones the county sheriff had quickly and quietly disposed of without filing any reports. That particular night in '94 started like any other. It was late August, and the heat lingered even after sunset, making the air feel thick and oppressive. We'd been having trouble with the perimeter fences. Posts kept coming loose in the sandy soil, and Tom was worried about cattle wandering onto the highway. He'd asked me to do a night check, making sure all the gates were secured. I remember checking my watch around 10 p.m., figuring I had another hour of work ahead of me. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in that peculiar silver light that makes the desert look like another planet. My old Ford pickup rattled along the fence line, headlights catching on strands of barbed wire and clusters of mesquite. The radio was playing softly, some late-night country station out of Alpine, when it started to crackle with static. That should have been my first warning. Radio interference was one of those things the old-timers said to watch out for, like sudden temperature drops or animals going quiet. But I was tired, thinking about the cold beer waiting in my fridge, and I ignored it. It was near the old windmill that I first saw them, two pale points of light hovering just above the ground. At first I figured it was reflections from my headlights catching something metallic, but when I killed the engine they were still there, steady and unnatural in the darkness. The smart thing would have been to radio back to the ranch house. We had a strict protocol about unusual sightings. Log it, report it, but don't investigate alone. Those rules existed for a reason, passed down through generations of ranch hands who'd learned the hard way that the desert was unforgiving of foolishness. But something about those lights drew me in. They had a quality I can't quite describe, like looking at a photo that's slightly out of focus, where your brain keeps trying to make sense of what it's seeing but can't quite manage it. I grabbed my rifle from the gun rack, an old .30, .30 Winchester that had belonged to my grandfather, and stepped out into the night. The desert air had grown notably colder as I approached the lights, my boots crunching softly on the sandy soil. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if my body was trying to warn me to turn back. The windmill creaked above me, its metal vanes catching moonlight as they turned lazily in the night breeze. That's when I saw the truck, an old pickup, maybe from the 70s, its paint job so faded I couldn't make out the color in the darkness. But it wasn't the truck that made my blood run cold. It was the figure crouched beside it, moving in that terrible, unnatural way that my mind still struggles to comprehend. The figure's movements were wrong in a way that defied description. Its limbs bent at impossible angles as it dug frantically at the desert floor, throwing sand aside with inhuman strength. In the truck's headlights, I could see long, dark stains down the front of what might have once been a white shirt, the wet gleam of fresh blood. The bundle it pulled from the earth made my heart stop. Wrapped in what looked like old blankets, but I could see pale flesh through the gaps, and dark hair matted with something I didn't want to think about. When it threw the bundle into the truck's cab, I saw her face, eyes wide and staring, throat torn open in a savage gash that nearly separated head from body. When it turned toward me, I saw its eyes. God help me, I'll never forget those eyes. They weren't human, too large, too bright, reflecting the moonlight like a coyote's. But there was intelligence there, and hunger, and something else. Something that knew me, knew everything about me, and wanted to do more than just kill. I fired without thinking, the Winchester's report shattering the desert silence. The creature moved faster than anything I'd ever seen, crossing the distance between us in a heartbeat. I caught a glimpse of teeth, too many teeth, as I turned to run. The trip back to my truck exists in my memory as fragments, snapshots of terror. The sound of feet behind me, not running but skittering like some giant insect. The smell of copper and rot carried on the wind. The way the moonlight seemed to dim, as if something was consuming it. I don't remember getting the key in the ignition, but I remember the engine roaring to life. In my rearview mirror, I saw it standing by the windmill, its shape somehow different now, taller, more angular, its head cocked at an impossible angle as it watched me flee. I drove straight to the Marfa Sheriff's Station, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. Deputy Sandra Martinez was on duty that night. I knew her. We'd gone to high school together back in Alpine. She listened to my story without interrupting, her face growing increasingly grave. The search party they sent out the next morning found nothing. No blood, no disturbed earth, no signs of struggle. Even the shell casing from my rifle was gone. But they did find something else. Deep scratches in the windmill's metal support beams, spaced wider than any animal could make. Tom McAllister didn't fire me when I refused to do any more night shifts. He'd been around long enough to know that some stories, crazy as they sounded, had truth in them. But things were different after that night. The other hands would fall quiet when I entered the bunkhouse. Conversations would stop mid-sentence. I spent months researching, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The Marfa Public Library had a section of local history books that the tourists never bothered with. In one, published in 1932, I found a photograph that stopped my heart. The same truck I'd seen that night, parked in front of the old mercury mine. The caption read, "Vehicle abandoned by missing prospector James Hardin, 1927. Over the years, I pieced together other incidents. Every decade or so, people would vanish in that part of the desert. Their bodies would sometimes turn up months later, miles from where they'd disappeared, torn open in ways that made experienced coroners quit their jobs, but never any evidence, never any witnesses. Except me. The woman's face haunted my dreams. I'd wake up sweating, convinced I could hear skittering sounds outside my window. The psychologist in Alpine diagnosed PTSD, prescribed pills that didn't help. How could they? Pills can't erase the knowledge that the world isn't what we think it is, that something walks in the desert darkness that should not exist. I tried to warn people. posted on message boards, reached out to investigators. Most thought I was crazy. Some wanted to turn my story into a book or movie, missing the point entirely. This wasn't entertainment, it was a warning. It's been 30 years since that night, and I'm still here in Marfa. Can't leave, though I've tried. Something about that encounter changed me, marked me in a way I can't explain. The desert keeps its secrets, but sometimes it shares them with you whether you want them or not. The lights still appear sometimes out by the old windmill. I've learned to look away, to drive past without slowing. But on quiet nights when the moon is full and the wind carries the smell of creosote and sage, I think about what's out there, what's always been out there, waiting in the spaces between towns, between thoughts, between what we know and what we fear. Last week, a tourist couple disappeared somewhere out past the Carson property. The police found their rental car, doors open, picnic lunch still spread out on the hood. No signs of violence, no tracks leading away, just emptiness, and in the soft desert soil, a single mark, like something heavy had been dragged or had dragged itself toward the old windmill. I should tell them what I know, should warn them about what hunts in the darkness, but who would believe me? And more importantly, what good would it do? Some things can't be stopped, can't be fought. Some things are as much a part of this land as the dust and the stars and the endless empty horizon. So I keep my silence and I stay away from the desert at night. And if you're ever driving through Marfa, through any of these lonely places where the radio stations fade to static and the stars seem too bright and too close, don't stop. Don't look too long into the darkness. And whatever you do, don't investigate strange lights in the distance. Because sometimes the desert doesn't just keep secrets. Sometimes it hungers for them. Growing up in a small Mexican town shapes your relationship with fear in peculiar ways. There's an intimacy to the darkness when you know every street, every corner, every abandoned building by heart. I wasn't a particularly brave child, but I found myself drawn to the paranormal despite my fears, or perhaps because of them. Looking back now, I realize that my hometown was the perfect setting for supernatural encounters, though I never expected to meet myself in the shadows. Our town nestled in a valley, cradled by hills that seemed to watch over us like ancient guardians. Most of the population clustered on one side of the tallest hills, creating a community that was both spread out and intensely connected. Crime was so rare it felt almost theoretical, which perhaps made us more vulnerable to other kinds of dangers, the ones that don't show up in police reports or newspaper headlines. Being the youngest of 5 children granted me an unusual degree of freedom. My parents' frequent absences meant I could stretch the boundaries of acceptable behavior, staying out later than I should, wandering further than was wise. Our house sat at the foothills of the steepest hill on our street, positioned perpendicular to 2 main thoroughfares. One of these roads led to a hill reserved for religious traditions, its sacred purpose adding another layer of mystery to our already enigmatic landscape. My grandmother's house stood like a fortress halfway up this main road, surrounded by my aunt's houses scattered across the expansive plot like satellites around a planet. It was the heart of our family's social life, the gathering place where we congregated almost every night, following a pattern as old and reliable as the moon's phases. The walk from there to my house typically took about 5 minutes, a distance that could feel like nothing during daylight hours, but transformed into an eternity after dark. That particular night stayed later than usual with my cousins, caught up in the warm embrace of family and forgetting how time tends to slip away when you're young and feel invincible. By the time I started my journey home, midnight had come and gone, leaving behind a world that felt subtly different from the one I knew during daylight hours. The streetlights along my route home were spaced too far apart to be truly useful, creating pools of harsh illumination separated by stretches of absolute darkness. Trees lined the street, their branches reaching across the gap between lights like grasping fingers, ensuring that even the illuminated spaces felt somehow compromised. The moon offered some relief, but its light seemed to make the shadows deeper, more purposeful. The walk home that night carried a different weight than usual. Each step down the hill felt like I was moving through something thicker than air, as if reality itself had become more dense after midnight. The sensation of being followed crept up slowly. Not the ordinary fear of footsteps behind you, but something more primal, more intimate. It wasn't danger I sensed exactly, but a presence that seemed to know me in ways I didn't know myself. My heart took up residence in my throat, beating a rhythm that felt foreign and familiar at the same time. Every few steps, I found myself compelled to look back, though I knew this would only feed my growing unease. The street remained empty each time I checked, yet the feeling of being watched intensified. The shadows between the streetlights seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with each pass I made through them. When I reached the corner that led to my street, relief should have started to set in. Instead, the anxiety that had been building reached a new peak as I approached the abandoned house, a permanent fixture in my childhood nightmares. It stood 3 houses down from the corner, a dark void in the otherwise lived-in neighborhood. The house had been empty for so long that no one could remember who had lived there last, or why they had left. Local children whispered stories about it, each tale more elaborate than the last, but none as strange as what I was about to experience. Normally, I would have taken my usual route on the opposite side of the street, maintaining the maximum possible distance between myself and that haunted structure. But fate or circumstance had other plans that night. Massive piles of construction sand and dirt blocked my escape route, and a neighbor's delivery truck parked against the curb forced me toward the center of the street, closer to the abandoned house than I'd been in years. The mental preparation required to pass the house felt like gearing up for battle. My heart, which had already been racing, now seemed to be attempting to escape my chest entirely. The fear was familiar. I'd felt it every time I passed this house. But that night it carried a different quality, as if the usual childhood terror had matured into something more sophisticated, more aware. That's when I heard my name. The voice came from the direction of the house, clear and distinct despite the absolute silence that had fallen over the street. I froze in place, my body responding before my mind could process what was happening. When I turned to look, I expected to see nothing. Just another trick of shadow and moonlight. The wave of relief that washed over me when I saw no one was so intense it made me lightheaded. But then the voice came again. What I saw next defied everything I understood about reality. Standing there as if he'd materialized from the darkness itself was a boy who appeared to be my age, perhaps slightly younger. The strangeness of his presence didn't register immediately. My mind trying to normalize the impossible, to fit it into a framework I could understand. It wasn't until several moments had passed that I realized I could see him with perfect clarity, despite standing in a patch of darkness that should have rendered him invisible. The shadows of the abandoned house loomed behind him, and a large tree blocked both moonlight and the distant street lamp. Yet he was visible, as if illuminated by his own inner light. This subtle wrongness was just the first thread that, when pulled, would unravel my entire understanding of what was possible. He stood unnaturally still, in a way that human bodies aren't meant to be still. No slight swaying, no subtle movements, just absolute perfect stillness that seemed to mock the very concept of life itself. His stare was fixed on me with an intensity that felt physical, like pressure against my skin. Time stretched and distorted around us, seconds extending into what felt like hours as we stood in this impossible tableau. When he spoke again, asking me to play with him, his voice carried both invitation and threat. The words themselves were innocent enough, but they came from a mouth that didn't quite move right, as if speech was a newly learned skill. I tried to respond, to scream, to run, but my body had become a prison of paralysis. Every instinct screamed for movement, yet I remained rooted to the spot, trapped in a moment that felt increasingly unreal. That's when I noticed the glow, a subtle luminescence that seemed to emanate from within him rather than fall upon him from any external source. It pulsed slightly, like a heartbeat, but with a rhythm that was just wrong enough to be deeply unsettling. The trembling that overtook my body felt distant, as if it was happening to someone else, while my mind raced with possibilities that each seemed more impossible than the last. His approach was the most disturbing part, each step accompanied by that strange shadow-passing effect, as if he was moving through layers of reality rather than physical space. His form would darken to complete blackness before brightening again, like someone rapidly flicking a light switch, except the darkness seemed to have depth, to be more substance than absence. Then came my name, my full name, spoken in a voice that was horrifyingly familiar. As he drew closer, the final revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. He wore my face, but those eyes contained nothing of childhood, nothing of humanity. They were windows into something ancient and malevolent, filled with a hatred that seemed to transcend personal animosity and touch on something fundamental about existence itself. In that moment of recognition, reality seemed to fracture along invisible fault lines. Seeing your own face twisted by inhuman hatred creates a kind of terror that bypasses all rational thought. It's not just fear of death or harm. It's the terror of having your very identity, your sense of self, violated by something that shouldn't exist. The wrongness of those eyes in what should have been my face created a cognitive dissonance that finally broke through my paralysis. My scream, that desperate no that finally escaped my throat, felt like it came from somewhere deeper than my lungs. It was a rejection not just of this entity, but of everything it represented. This corruption of self, this mockery of human form. The sound seemed to shatter whatever spell had held me in place, releasing a flood of adrenaline that propelled me into the fastest run of my life. The mechanics of that flight remain oddly clear in my memory, even as everything else from that night has taken on a dreamlike quality. I remember the burning in my legs, the ragged sound of my breathing, the way the street seemed to elongate before me like a stretched rubber band. What I don't remember, what I deliberately didn't check, was whether it followed me. Some primal instinct told me that looking back would be worse than whatever might be gaining on me. The distance to my house, which normally took several minutes to walk, disappeared in what felt like seconds. My feet barely seemed to touch the ground as I ran, driven by a terror that went beyond anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just fear of the supernatural anymore. It was fear of something that challenged the very nature of identity and reality itself. The entity didn't pursue me, at least not physically. But in a way, it's been following me ever since, not as a presence, but as a question mark in my understanding of the world. What was it really? A supernatural entity? A manifestation of something darker? A doppelganger from folklore come to life? The questions pile up, but answers remain elusive. People often ask me to speculate about what I encountered that night, to try to categorize it within some framework of supernatural understanding. But honestly, I prefer my ignorance. Some mysteries are better left unexplored. Some questions better left unanswered. What I saw that night exists in a category of its own, a personal horror that defies classification. The abandoned house still stands in my old neighborhood, I'm told. Children still avoid it, though none know my story. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, that thing with my face and hatred in its eyes, waiting for another late-night wanderer. Or perhaps it moved on, finding new faces to wear, new identities to corrupt, new fears to exploit. Years have passed since that night, but certain details remain etched in my memory with unnatural clarity. The way the entity's form fluctuated between darkness and light, the perfect stillness of its posture, the terrible familiarity of its face, my face, twisted by that inhuman hatred. These images surface in dreams sometimes, though they've lost some of their power to terrify. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest edges of fear, though it can't completely erase them. The experience changed how I interact with mirrors and photographs, especially at night. There's always that moment of hesitation before looking at my reflection, a split-second fear that I might see those wrong eyes looking back at me. The full impact of encountering your own doppelganger isn't something you can process all at once. It unspools slowly over years, affecting you in ways you don't initially recognize. Mexican folklore has many stories about encounters with supernatural duplicates, from the ancient Aztec beliefs about spiritual doubles to more recent tales of dark entities that steal faces and identities. But none of these stories quite capture what I experienced. The entity I met wasn't just wearing my appearance. It seemed to understand something about me that I didn't know myself, as if it had access to parts of my identity that existed beyond my own awareness. The abandoned house became something of a local legend in the years that followed, though not because of my experience. I never shared the story with anyone in town. Other children reported strange sightings, figures in windows, lights where there shouldn't be any, voices calling their names. But as far as I know, no one else ever encountered their own duplicate standing in those shadows. Sometimes I wonder about the timing of it all. Why that particular night? Was it random chance that put me in that specific place at that specific moment? Or was there something more deliberate at work? The construction materials that forced me to walk closer to the house, the truck that blocked my usual escape route, were these just coincidences or part of some larger design? The question of whether it was truly evil remains complicated. The hatred in its eyes was undeniable, but was it directed at me specifically, or at something more fundamental about human existence? There was something almost sad about it, as if it resented having to wear a human face at all, as if mimicking life was a burden it carried with bitter resentment. The town has grown and changed since then. New streetlights have been installed, trees have been trimmed back, and the shadows between houses don't seem quite as deep as they used to be. But the essential mystery of that night remains untouched by time or progress. Some experiences exist outside the normal flow of cause and effect, creating ripples that continue to spread through your life long after the initial encounter. I've researched similar experiences over the years, diving into accounts of doppelganger encounters from around the world. There are patterns that emerge: the sense of wrongness, the hatred in the eyes, the way these entities seem to understand their victims on an uncomfortably deep level. But each story is also unique, as if these creatures tailor their appearances and behaviors to create the maximum impact on their chosen targets. The scientific part of my mind has suggested various explanations over the years: sleep deprivation, stress, the peculiar psychology of adolescence. But none of these explanations account for the physical details I remember so clearly: the way it moved through layers of darkness, the impossible clarity of its form in the shadows, the sound of my full name in that terrible voice that was both mine and not mine. What I've come to understand is that some experiences don't need to be fully explained to be meaningful. That night changed my understanding of reality in ways that can't be undone. It taught me that identity, the very concept of self, is more fragile and mysterious than we like to believe. The face we wear, the person we think we are, might just be one version among many possible iterations. The streets of my hometown are still walked by children after dark, and the abandoned house still stands as a silent sentinel to whatever mysteries it contains. Sometimes I think about warning them, about sharing my story as a cautionary tale. But I realize that some discoveries have to be made personally. Some boundaries have to be tested individually. The night has its own lessons to teach, and sometimes those lessons wear familiar faces. I've never returned to that spot after dark, never tested whether the entity might still be waiting there. Some courages are better left unproven, some challenges better left unmet. The memory of those hatred-filled eyes in my own face serves as reminder enough that reality has depths we can't fathom, and sometimes the most terrifying things we can encounter are reflections of ourselves that we never knew existed. I've always found solace in the quiet of the woods. There's something about the way sunlight filters through the canopy, the way dead leaves crunch underfoot, that speaks to something primitive in the human soul. My name is Randall Kerwin, and until last October I spent nearly every weekend hunting in the forests of North America. Not by profession, I'm an architectural engineer by trade, but by passion, by something deeper than mere hobby. The incident that changed everything happened in the Blackwater National Forest, a vast stretch of wilderness that spans nearly 300,000 acres. Looking back, I can see the warning signs we missed, the little details that should have told us something was wrong. But hindsight has a clarity that the present never does. My hunting partner, Hal Emerson, and I had been planning the trip for weeks. We'd known each other since college, two city kids who discovered their love for hunting in their 30s. Hal was the more experienced hunter. He'd grown up in rural Montana before moving east for work. He taught me most of what I knew about tracking and woodcraft, turning my amateur enthusiasm into something approaching skill. We left the city early on a Friday morning, my Ford F-150 loaded with our gear. The drive up was familiar. We'd made it dozens of times before. But something felt different that day. The weather, maybe. A heavy fog had settled over the mountains, thick enough that we had to slow down on the winding forest roads. The radio kept cutting out, static interrupting the morning news until we finally gave up and turned it off. Weather report said clear skies, Hal commented, checking his phone. No signal up here anyway. We parked at our usual spot, a small turnout near an old logging trail. The fog had thinned somewhat, but visibility was still poor, maybe 50 yards at best. We checked our gear methodically, rifles, my Remington 700 and Hal's Winchester Model 70, ammunition, emergency supplies, radios, GPS units. Standard procedure, but we'd learned the hard way that shortcuts in preparation usually meant problems later. The first few hours were uneventful. We separated to cover more ground, keeping in radio contact every 30 minutes. I was tracking what looked like promising deer sign, fresh droppings, broken twigs at the right height, the kind of evidence that usually meant good hunting. But something felt off. The forest was too quiet. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows that silence isn't natural. There should be background noise, birds, insects, small animals going about their business. But as I moved deeper into the forest following those signs, the world seemed to grow increasingly still. I checked my watch, 11:45 a.m. We were supposed to meet back at the clearing by noon. I was about to turn back when I found the first body. He was propped against a tree, as if he'd sat down to rest. A hunter, judging by his orange vest and camo pants. His rifle lay beside him, unfired. At first glance he looked peaceful, like he might have dozed off. But the expression frozen on his face told a different story. I've seen dead bodies before. It's an unavoidable part of hunting long enough. Animals die. Sometimes people die. But this was different. His face was contorted in an expression of absolute terror, mouth open in a silent scream. There were no visible wounds, no blood, nothing to indicate what had killed him. My first instinct was to radio Hal, but all I got was static. I checked my GPS unit. Dead, despite having fresh batteries. Even my watch had stopped, though I hadn't noticed when. The fog seemed to be getting thicker, developing a strange, oily quality that made it hard to gauge distances. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong in any forest I'd ever hunted. It started as a low-frequency vibration, more felt than heard. like the bass at a concert. But it changed, modulating into something that resembled speech, if speech could exist without a human throat to produce it. I raised my rifle, training it on the direction of the sound. Years of hunting had taught me to control my breathing, to steady my hands even when every instinct screamed for flight. The fog seemed to pulse now, synchronized with that otherworldly sound. Movement caught my eye, something large, moving between the trees about 40 yards out. The fog made it hard to see clearly, but what I could make out didn't make sense. It moved wrong, like something wearing a costume of an animal but not quite understanding how joints were supposed to work. I clicked off my rifle's safety, the small sound impossibly loud in the unnatural silence. The creature stopped. For a moment, nothing moved. Then it turned toward me, and I saw its face. I've spent decades in the woods. I've seen bears, mountain lions, wolves, every major predator in North America. But this was something else. Its features seemed to shift and change as I looked at it, never quite settling into anything recognizable. But its eyes, God, its eyes were almost human. They held an intelligence that made my blood run cold. I fired. The shot echoed through the trees, but the creature didn't react. It just kept watching me with those terrible eyes. I fired again, and again. Each shot seemed to pass through it as if it were made of smoke. Then it moved. One moment it was 40 yards away. The next it was almost on top of me. I caught a glimpse of limbs that were too long, joints that bent in impossible ways before it struck. The impact sent me sprawling, my rifle flying from my hands. Pain exploded across my chest. Not the tearing I'd expected, but something worse. It felt like ice and fire at the same time, like my nerve endings were being rewritten. I rolled, somehow keeping my feet under me, and ran. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted through the undergrowth. I could hear it behind me moving with that same impossible speed. The fog seemed to thicken, making it hard to see where I was going. Branches whipped at my face, roots